Good morning, Barry Bryson here. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew today, and we're going to begin studying in chapter 24, verse 1. This is the beginning of the last sermon that Jesus delivers, the last of 5. And if you'll recall, we mentioned just a few sessions ago that every one of the 5 sermons that Jesus delivers is followed by the passage, and after he had said these things, and then it tells us the result of his teaching. This is the eschatological sermon, the word eschatology meaning that which has to do with end times, and it is prompted by 2 questions that the apostles asked to him, although I'm not sure they understood. They asked 2 questions. It covers chapters 24 and 25, and I want to just take a little time to introduce it. It begins with them asking 2 questions. Jesus, of course, we've already said this, he's in Jerusalem for his final week, but he's not staying in Jerusalem. He's staying in Bethany, 2 miles away on the other side of the Mount of Olives, and they're crossing back and forth as they come into the town each day and then go back home to someone's home in Bethany. And we know he knows Simon there. He also knows Mary, Martha, and Lazarus there. So he's got places to stay. He's going to Bethany to spend the night. He's not spending the night in the city. And as they're leaving one day, they stop on the hill across from the hill of Jerusalem, and they look back, and they can see the second temple, which Herod had made into a lavish campus of colonnades, porches around that second temple. It was one of the great showplaces of the first century. It was a tourist attraction. Actually, it was such a magnificent structure, and they're looking at it. In the evening, they're looking from east to west. They're watching the sunset over the temple, and Jesus calls their attention to it, and he says, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another which will not be torn down." And that's stunning to them, that this temple is going to be destroyed. It was only recently completed, at least the campus around it had only recently been completed. It was only a few decades old, actually. The temple structure itself had been built by the returnees at the end of the 6th century BC. And the beginning of the 5th, but the magnificent thing that was this temple compound was only a few decades old. And this is stunning to them. And they ask Jesus 2 questions. They ask him, tell us when these things will be, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now we need to pay attention to that question, because this eschatological sermon is going to contain apocalyptic elements. And every time most people read apocalyptic elements in the Bible, they think the end of time. And sometimes it is the end of time, but not always. It is more precisely the end of an age. Apocalyptic literature, which is a genre of literature, the way prophecy, poetry, history are genres of biblical literature. Apocalyptic is a genre with its own conventions, which we'll talk about later when we get to the apocalyptic sections. But apocalyptic literature does not always describe, or even most of the time, describe the end of time. It describes the end of an era. And in the Old Testament, apocalyptic literature can be used of Assyrian captivity, Babylonian captivity, the coming of the Messiah, or the coming of a locust plague. It is the end of an era when a cycle of time is ended and another cycle of time begins. And so I'm not sure that they knew what they were asking. I'm sure that in their minds that the destruction of the temple meant the coming of the Messiah in his glory, which they did not believe was coming from heaven, but that Jesus would be leading probably a conquering army, and the end of time, perhaps. Jesus answers this 2 questions. He gives 2 answers to 2 different questions. What will be the sign of the destruction of Jerusalem? And what do we know about the end of time? And both of these events represent his coming. And so he does answer every element of the questions that they ask. And he's going to make that clear in 24 and 25. Now, I want us to look at verse 36, because up until verse 36, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which will happen in AD 70 after a rebellion against Rome, and terrible 4 years in which Jews were killing Jews en masse. And then at the second part of this lesson, he talks about, of this sermon, he talks about the end of time. And there's a clear distinction, because he says in verse 36, after talking about the destruction of the temple, he says, but of that day and hour, the end of time, no one knows, not the angels in heaven or the Son, but the Father alone. That's such an amazing verse, this thought that Jesus gives to us to ponder. We'll talk more about it when we get to it. But he makes clear that one day you can't predict. I can tell you the signs, you can see when it's coming, and you can be prepared. The other day, nobody knows. The angels don't know. I don't even know. I'm the Son of God, and I don't even know. Only the Father knows when that's going to be. So you have to always be prepared for that day. So that's going to be key in our study of this last sermon. It's going to be key for us to remember that Jesus is describing two separate events, both of which express his coming, both of which represent his plan coming to fruition. But they're two separate events. One of them is predictable. One of them we can tell the signs of the times and we can be prepared for. The other one is coming when we least expect it. He's already said this in his teaching in Matthew. If the person knew when the thief was coming, he'd be prepared. But we don't know that. Whenever the second coming, which will be the end of all time, the end of the heaven and of the universe, and the earth in it, no one knows that. Jesus said, I don't even know it. And if Jesus doesn't know it, no one else can go through and comb Scripture through and pick out verses from here and there and tell you that it's what year it's going to be and what the stock market's going to look like and who's going to be in control in the Middle East. No, it has nothing to do with any of that. Everything that Jesus gives us as a sign before verse 36 is going to take place within the lifespan of the people who were listening to them. He says that too. And we'll notice that when we continue with the text. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.